We are Plum Creek, and we are a place where you matter. Our mission here is centered around changed lives, changing lives. We believe this happens through 3 relationships: intimacy with God, intentionality with family, and influence with others. God has something He wants to say specifically to you wherever you are. Our hope is that you will leave encouraged and closer to Him than ever before. We'd love to connect with you online at plumcreekonline.com or on social media, where you can see how Plum Creek is impacting our community and what opportunities we have for you and your family to get connected. If you'd like to support the ministry we're doing here in Castle Rock, the 2 easiest ways are through the Give tab on our website or via your mobile device by texting your dollar amount to the number on the screen. Thanks again for joining us. We hope you'll enjoy this message.
Good morning. It's good to be here with you. As Gary mentioned, I served as a pastor. I worked at 2 churches, worked at 2 great churches. But something happened to me that changed the trajectory of my vocational life. I got obsessed with this prayer of Jesus that's found in John chapter 17. It's the last recorded prayer that we have of Jesus before he's arrested. And in that moment, he prays for himself and for what he's getting ready to go through. He prays for the disciples, and then he prays for all of us. He prays for every believer that was alive at that time and every believer to come. And his prayer in that crucial moment is simply that we would be one. And he prays for unity, and he doesn't just pray for unity for the sake of unity. He prays for unity. He says that when there's oneness among the people that already follow him, that people that don't know God in some beautiful, powerful, mystical way, get sucked towards him. And as I continued to dwell on that passage and to think about it, it got into me. I started to go to bed at night thinking about this and really ask the question, like, what if I actually believe that this is true? What if one of the best things that I can give my time and my energy to is just simply bringing unity in the body? And so I started to meet with other pastors in my city, in my community, and I started to find out that a lot of them had this same passion. And so we started to come together, and we started to meet and pray and to dream about what it would look like to stack hands in our city and to mobilize the Big C church, and especially with serving people in need in our community. And we realized early on, we got really excited about the idea of working together, but then we realized that we didn't know our community as well as we should. We actually couldn't answer the question of what's the most strategic thing that we should do if we're going to bring everyone and help them work together. And so we started to reach out to local civic leaders. We would bring in our city manager, a police chief, and about 6.5 years ago, I was sitting in a room with lead pastors from 23 different churches. And we're sitting in this room, and we've got our mayor in the room. And this is up in Arvada. And we ask him, hey, what's your dream for our city is the first thing we asked him. And then we asked him, if you could wave a magic wand and change something, what would you change? And we would always ask people that question. We'd get out a little piece of paper, and we're like, all right, we're going to figure out what our thing is that we're going to all go after. And so he comes, he had this piece of paper, he had written down all this stuff. So if you're going to get civic leaders to come and hang out with weird Christian pastors, then you have to tell them what you're going to do. You can't just do surprises to them. So we had told them, hey, here's all we want you to do. Show up, answer these 2 questions. We promise nothing weird's going to happen. And so he shows up, he's got his list, and he starts to read down this list of his things that he'd like to see change in our city. And he said, I want to live in a city where there's no elderly shut-ins, where there's no at-risk kids, where there's no single moms living below the poverty line, where there's no financial debt. And he had this list of 11 different things, and they were all good. And then he puts this piece of paper away, And then very much in passing, he says, if you guys want to do something that would have the biggest impact on our city, you should start some kind of a neighboring movement with all of those people that go to all those churches. And then he just moved on. He's going to start talking about something else. And we're like, whoa, go back to that. Let's talk more about that. And he starts to share with us about why neighboring matters, especially for somebody who is a leader in local government. And he said this, he said, the majority of the issues that our community is facing would be eliminated or drastically reduced if we could just become a community of people who are great neighbors. We can start another program for elderly shut-ins, or that person who's growing older and more isolated could live on a block where the people who live around him or her know them and care for them. We can start another Boys and Girls Club because there's a number of people who are kids who are growing up without a parental figure, or that kid could live on a block where other healthy adults are bringing them into the life, into the fabric of their family. And then he said this beautiful line. He said, what we're learning at the city level is that relationships always trump programs. That relationships always trump programs. That neighboring matters. Now, I want you to put yourself in that room. Imagine that you make your living helping people orient their lives around the teachings of God and Jesus. That's your job, okay? Imagine that? It's a horrifying thought for a lot of you. It's horrifying even for me. So that's what I did for a living, and my friends and I did for a living. Now, imagine what it feels like when God uses your mayor to tell you that the smartest thing you can do for your city is the thing that Jesus said matters most. Our mayor was saying, hey, that love your neighbor thing? You guys should actually do that. It'd be really smart. It was a bad moment. We're sitting there in that room going, this is not good. This shouldn't have to happen. Our mayor shouldn't have to tell us to do the Bible. We should have figured this out by now. It was one of those gut punch moments where you go, this hurts, and there's something really potent happening here. And so he got done, and he left the room, and we all sat around, and we're like, I think we need to spend some time thinking about what we just heard. And we agreed that we would come back in 2 months and that we would meet again. And I remember driving home from that meeting into my cul-de-sac, and there's 100 thoughts going through my head. The two that I can remember very vividly are this. I had this thought, I realized, I was like, Jesus is smart. You'd think I'd know that as a pastor, right? I'm like, wait a minute. Jesus gets asked to boil the entire text down to one thing, and he says, love God with everything you have, love your neighbor as yourself. And it dawned on me, is it possible that when Jesus has asked that question, that the answer that he gives us is a very simple strategic plan that if every believer did it, it would change the world overnight? That was the first thought. The second thought I had is that I realized that I wasn't doing it. I was involved in a lot of good things. As a pastor, I was trying to help people figure out their marriages and their life with their kids. I was doing outreach events, hoping that people who didn't know God might walk in the doors of our church. I was sitting on the board of 3 different nonprofits at that time. I feel I wasn't just sitting around binge watching, Netflix. I was doing some good stuff, but I was putting almost zero intentionality into what was going on in my own neighborhood. I was busy doing this other stuff that I was choosing to do. And I walked in my house, and my wife, Lauren's been ahead of me in most things in my life, and certainly this was the case with neighboring, but I told her what happened, and she just looked at me and said, what are you going to do about that? What are you going to do about the fact that the mayor just asked you to do the Bible and told you that it's a really smart way to help our city? And I didn't want to have a lot of accountability. And so what I told her, I said, you know what, I'm gonna hang out more in the front yard, and then I'll just kind of see if anything happens. And I'm gonna do that for a year. And that little 1-year experiment has now lasted 7 years, and it's totally screwed up my whole life. It's been really messy, and it's also been really beautiful. And I don't want to go back. Like God has used this really simple thought and this simple practice to remind me that the way that Jesus talks about living, it actually is the best way to live. And I'll tell you a little bit about how that's played out in my own neighborhood here in a few minutes. But let me tell you what happened to this little group of pastors. So we're all sitting in that room. We have that moment. We come back 2 months later. And when we came back 2 months later, I invited this lady, Vicky, to come and join us. So Vicky was our assistant city manager. Everybody, when I was going around asking that magic wand question, they would always tell me, go talk to Vicky, go talk to Vicky. And so for 2 years leading up to that mayor meeting, I'm annoying Vicky, and I'm like, hey, Vicky, what should we do with all these people and all these congregations? And Vicky would always say the same thing. She would say, hey, Dave, next time it snows, why don't you get every one of those people to like shovel their neighbor's driveway? And when she would say that to me, I would just think to myself, no. I was like I wanted something sexy that we were gonna like take on. I didn't want to like shovel people's driveways. I wanted like the church eradicates homelessness or something. I could see the headline in my mind. But when the mayor like says the neighboring thing, I'm going, oh no, Vicky has been trying to tell me this the whole time. So Vicky comes to our meeting, and she just is like a fire hydrant. She starts to share with us about all these like really powerful ways that neighboring matters. She talks about the fact that in neighborhoods where people know the first names of their neighbors, the crime rate is 80% less. She talks about the fact that people live significantly longer when they know and are connected with their actual neighbors. She shared about the fact, and we've all seen this in the last month and a half, that when there's a natural disaster, your neighbor is almost all, or your neighbors are almost always the first responders because the systems get overwhelmed. And so this whole time we're sitting there listening to her, we're going, man, that's good, but we're also thinking, and Jesus said to do this. And at the end of our time that Vicky was with us, there was a pastor there, and I asked a question, and Vicky, she wasn't trying to be mean at all. She just was like being honest, and she said this thing that was like very painful for us to hear, but she looked at one of the pastors and said, hey, you know, from the city's perspective, there isn't a noticeable difference in how Christians and non-Christians neighbor in our city. And it felt so horrible to hear somebody say that we started to argue with her about her perception. And then we stopped because we realized she was right, that believers in our community and in this community aren't differentiated by how they treat their actual neighbors. I know this because I've shared her quote in rooms with leaders from over 500 different cities, and never once has a civic leader come up to me and said, oh, Dave, in our city, the Christians are the best neighbors. It's not even close. And that one thought from her put us, all this little pastors group, in crisis, because it made us start to try to reconcile this. Like, how is it possible that if you boil the entire text down to one thing, it's all about loving God with everything you have and loving your neighbor as yourself, but yet in our city, on our blocks, in our country, in our culture, there isn't a noticeable difference in the way Christians and non-Christians treat their actual neighbors? Like, how we were forced to think, like, how do I make sense of that? And as I started to ask that question, I started to get really irritated. And you ever see something on the news? I'm sure this has never happened to you recently. You see something on the news and you start to get mad? That's what was happening to me. And I kept asking that same question. I was just feeling irritated. And then I started to ask a different question. And it changed my mood. I started to ask this question. I wonder how you end up as a pastor who's not engaged in his own neighborhood. And my mood went from being irritated to really convicted and reflective. And as I started to wrestle through that, I started to read texts, scriptures that I had read hundreds of times, that I'd given multiple sermons on, and they started to take on a whole new light. And one of those is the story that we've been looking at over the last 3 weeks. And so if you have your Bible, you can turn to Luke chapter 10. If not, we'll put it up here on the screen. As I've shared my story with others, I've come to believe that many of us that have grown up around the church have become inoculated to the Great Commandment. It's one of these things that we hear over and over and over again, and then somehow, because of the familiarity, we distance ourselves from it. We go, oh man, that Jesus, that's good. That's really good. But then we actually don't do it in our real life. We figure out a way out of it. That's what happened to me. And the Bible, I think, has something very interesting to say about this. So we're going to pick it up in Luke 10, verse 25. And it says this: on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he asked, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" he replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." Think about how powerful just that would. Do this and you will live. But look at this phrase right here in verse 29. This is what just came screaming off the page at me. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" This guy comes to Jesus, asks a very straightforward question. Jesus does this a couple times in the Gospels. He knows that's not what's really going on here. So he invites the person to answer his own question, and he gives like the perfect textbook answer. And Jesus affirms him, and Jesus says, "That's right. It's exactly right." And look at this guy's response. But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" His first thought is, I wonder how I get out of this. Where's the loophole? And how he does it is fascinating. Jesus, neighbor, like, what does that really mean? His first thought is, I wonder if I can define that word neighbor so that it most easily fits into what I'm already doing. I wonder if I can define that word neighbor as I choose to. I wonder if there's some wiggle room here. So you want to know how you can become a pastor who's not engaged in his own neighborhood? All you have to do is this. You have to be exactly like this guy. You just got to define that word neighbor so that it easily fits into what you're already doing. Do you want to know how we can become a group of people who aren't known as being the best neighbors in town? All you have to do is this. Just define neighbor as you choose to. That's what I did. And how I did it was fascinating. I'll let you behind the curtains here. I used the story of the Good Samaritan to get out of actually doing it. Okay, now, so what Jesus does in this moment is brilliant. He looks at this guy, he's like, "Oh, we're going to play the let's define it game." And he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, he's assuming that this guy is neighboring with the people of his same culture and custom. So he gives him the graduate level version of neighboring. He just blows the definition of neighboring up on this guy. He tells the story of the Good Samaritan. We've been talking about this the last couple of weeks here. The story of the Good Samaritan. The big idea is everybody is your neighbor. Everybody's my neighbor. That's actually not what the story of the Good Samaritan says. That's what I thought it said for most of my life, is that everybody was my neighbor. That was my big takeaway from that story. Here's what the story of the Good Samaritan says. It says, when you care for the person who's in front of you, no matter who it is or no matter who you are being a neighbor to that person. There's a difference between those two things. When you just kind of go, everybody's my neighbor, what happens is, or at least what happened to me, is I ended up with a really powerful metaphoric love for my metaphoric neighbor. And metaphorically, I was just killing it. And in real life, there were people who were sleeping 30, 40, 50 feet away from me, and I didn't even know their names. Because I chose, I got so busy doing all this other stuff, I just thought to myself, I'm doing a lot of good stuff, I'm kind of just neighboring all the time. And I started to think about the stuff I was doing at the church, and I started to think about the stuff that I had volunteered at the rescue mission. I was like, man, I'm doing all that love your neighbor stuff. And I acted because I was doing all that somehow magic fairy dust got sprinkled over my actual neighborhood, and all of a sudden Jesus wasn't talking about those people. And I'm just going to tell you something. If you have the courage to unwind that, if you have the courage to just draw a circle around the place that God has put you, not do the grad school, but actually just go back to kindergarten when it comes to this idea of the Great Commandment, what will happen as a result will blow your mind. If we there's something about proximity-based relationships that are really powerful. Most of us just drift into affinity-based relationships. We just end up hanging out with people that we think are funny or that have lots of things in common with us, and those are great relationships. I don't want to dismiss those at all. And by the way, I want to say something. I want to give you a little caveat here. Some of you might be thinking to yourself, you know what, Dave, I spend more time at work than I do in my neighborhood, and I'm building all these friendships with people at work, or I'm really investing heavily with these parents on my kids' soccer team, or I love Neighborhood Network, and I'm really invested down there. And those are all neighboring relationships, and you're getting ready to do some weird thing to me here where you're not going to count those. And I want to say this. Everything that I just said, that's true. In Jesus' economy, clearly, those are all neighboring relationships. When you're over on the other side of the world and you're caring for somebody, and the person in front of you, you're being a neighbor to that person. I don't want to dismiss that. I don't want to invalidate it at all. But as I said, all of that doesn't somehow make like our actual neighbors like Jesus wasn't talking about them. And a lot of us, myself included, we drift into a place where that's the case. And so what I learned, and my friends and I learned to do, was just to say, I wonder if I should just like start taking some small steps with the people right around me. And my first thought was, I don't have time for this. I've got so much other stuff. And then I started to realize, like, we're not talking about enormous amounts of time as we start down this road. And we came up with this little exercise that bore a lot of fruit for us personally as a group of pastors and for a lot of the people in our city. And so I believe in this exercise so much that we're going to do it here. I'm going to give you a little test right here in the middle of the church service. If you've done this before, it's a pop quiz. But here's a little exercise, okay? I want you to imagine you walk outside the front door of your apartment, your home, your ranch, whatever it is, okay? Just you walk outside the front door and just kind of imagine the 6 closest units to you. You got it? It's the 6 closest. There's a little visual for you. If you have a piece of paper, you can just draw 6 boxes right now. If you don't, you can do this in your head. I just want you to imagine those places. Now, just take a moment to like rattle off or write down the names. We'll just do just the adults. The names of the adults that live in those 6 places. So go ahead, right now. Let's do it right here. Just kind of think through that. This guy's cheating. He's asking his wife. If you're writing these down, you have to put like real, don't write down annoying lady, okay? Put like real dude who drives a blue car. Leave it blank if you don't know their actual name. Okay, when I first did this, I could do 2 of the boxes. I could only do 2. I had met them all. But only 2 of those households were they important enough that I actually remembered their name. So how many right now in this room, if I called you up here, you could rattle off the adults' names in all 6 of those? Raise your hand. 2. Okay? 15% of the room. How many, if I called you up here right now, you could do 4 of the 6? Raise your hand. Keep your hand up. It's 30% of the room. I want to tell you something I think is staggering. We've done this exercise a lot. We've handed out over 300,000 of these little refrigerator magnets that you're going to get when you walk out of here today. I've never been in a room of Christians where more than half of the room can write down more than half of their neighbors' names. And the reason I think that is important is because I've come to believe that in order to love somebody, it's helpful to know their first name. It's crazy. It's a crazy thought. It actually does help. Let me tell you what happened to me. My wife drew this on a napkin and put it on our fridge. And all this stuff is like all colliding on me. And I just made a commitment. I'm like, okay, I'm going to take the first steps. I'm going to learn the names. I'm going to retain them. I'm going to write them down. I'm going to start using these people's names when I see them. And like 2 days after I had made that decision, I'm sitting out in my driveway, and I look across the street and over one house, and my neighbor's over there, and he's mowing his front yard. And I'm sitting there, and I go, oh yeah, this is a great chance. And before I even took a step, I had this thought. I thought, you know what? I can't go over there while he's mowing his lawn. That's weird. And I thought, I'll just make up something to do in the front yard, and then I'll go over, and I'm like, that's more weird. And then I actually had this thought. I thought, I'll go back inside, and I bet when I come out, and I just realized I'm doing it right now. I'm trying to figure out a loophole. And I remember this like it was yesterday. I remember taking that step and walking down my driveway, and I walked down my driveway, and I walked across the street, and my neighbor's like mowing his lawn. He's like looking at me in my mind. I'm thinking, he's thinking, why am I doing this? I'm not running. This is an emergency. And so I walk up, got my head down, and he stops the lawnmower. And I'm right there, I look at him, I'm like, hey, man, which was my name for him. I always called him man. My other neighbor was bro. I kept them totally separate. And we just had a nice little arrangement there until I did this. Until I leaned in and had this mildly awkward conversation. I said, hey, this is really embarrassing. I know I've met you 3 times. I know we've lived next to each other for 18 months now. But I forgot your name. And I stuck out my hand. I said, I'm Dave. And he said something horrible. He said, I know. But he was really nice. And he said, I'm Matt, my wife Jan. And we talked for 20 seconds. And then I went back into my house and I did something really important. I wrote it down. And after a few weeks, this whole thing was filled in. And God did something to me. Like these people who were like faces, who drove a certain type of car with a certain number of kids, all of a sudden, just by learning their name, they started to become real people with real stories. And it went from, hey, man, to, hey, Matt. You know, just seeing somebody, that difference between somebody being a stranger and an acquaintance. To, hey, Matt, did you see the end of the game last night? Was that not amazing? To, hey, Matt, I've got this thing in my garage. I just need to move it like 10 feet. Could you come over and help me? To, hey, you guys are going to be watching the game, and we're going to be watching the game. Let's just like throw some stuff on the grill and watch it together. To, hey, your son's car is back there a lot now. Did he move back in? Like, has that been hard? To sitting across a dining room table and the 4 of us just like sharing our lives together, like the things that we love, the things that make us tick, our stories. Like this conversation that I only like dreamed and prayed and hoped about having as I was like setting up chairs in this outreach event. It was like sitting there happening in my home, right across the dining room table. It was all sitting right there for the taking. It was all right outside my front door. And it never happens if you don't learn their names. It never happens if you don't take the next small step. And that's what I really want to put in front of you here today is like, would you be willing, like in light of like the fact that Jesus said, if you only do one thing, love God with everything you have, heart, mind, soul, strength, and love your neighbors yourself. In light of that, would you be willing to make a commitment to start having some mildly awkward conversations and just to write down your neighbors' names and when you see them to use their names? Sounds like really simple, right? By the way, the reason like Doug and the staff here have asked me to come and to share what they asked me to do is like set the bar so low that you can't like crawl underneath it. I'm not asking you to love somebody. That's crazy Jesus stuff. I'm asking like, would you like actually just like, would you make a commitment to just learn and retain the people's names who live around you? And P.S., the reason why we're making the bar so low is because I know this from my own story. It's a Trojan horse that'll lead you into this whole other deal. Some of your neighbors, that's all you're going to learn. You're just going to learn their names because they actually don't want to be your friend. Some of my neighbors don't want to be my friend. They're super busy and they're like really stressed out. And every day they come home from work and they grab all of their kids and then they go to like 10 different activities. And on the way home, they grab fast food and then they come back home and they open up their garage and they get their car and then they close their garage and they detox from all of that. And then they wake up the next day and they do it again. And you're going to learn their name and you're hardly ever going to see them. And I have a lot of grace for them because I think that's how my neighbors experienced me for most of my life. But I want to tell you something. Some of your neighbors are dying for relationship. They may not be able to articulate it. They might not even know it, but they're dying for something that's just a little bit below the surface. You know, we get in here and hopefully you're in a small group and you have a group of people that you're talking to about things that matter. And it's really easy to assume and to think that most of the people who live around you have something like that too. Let me tell you something. Here's what I've learned from this whole thing. They don't. Most of the people who live around you, what they have is like this super surfacey stuff that happens at work. And then they have the dysfunctional stuff that we all have in our extended family. And that's it. And when we actually just lean in a little bit, when we're the kind of people that say, hey, tell me like, how did you end up in construction? Hey, like your kids are a little bit older than mine. Like, what are you learning right now about parenting? When we're the kind of people that ask those types of questions after we actually remember their people's names, when we're the kind of people that like have people into our home every once in a while, even if it's just once a month, the gospel starts to take shape. Like the kingdom starts to break out. We start to like actually live into what Jesus put before us in the Great Commandment. And so oftentimes for us, it's just like if you take the first step, if you get the first obstacle out of the way when it comes to a relationship, oftentimes organic stuff will just start to follow. But you have to take the first step. You have to stop like treating the Great Commandment, the idea of loving your neighbor, like it's some idealistic bumper sticker, and start to actually think that like, oh, that's like an actual attainable thing that Jesus put in front of us. And said, by the way, P.S., if you only do one thing, love God and love your neighbor. There's a text that has had a huge impact on me that I'd love to share with you. It's found in Acts. It's in Acts 17. And Paul's sitting here in Athens, and he's talking to all these people in this marketplace. And it's one of the all-time great sermons. It's found in the Bible. And as part of this sermon, here's what he says. He says, from one man, he made every nation of men that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the time set for them in the exact places where they should live. So God determined the time set for them in the exact places where they should live. God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. This scripture changed the way I drive into and out of my neighborhood. Because what it says is this, it says you don't live where you live by accident. It's not because you always wanted to have 4 bedrooms up, or you love the curb appeal or the school district. It's not because you can't afford to live in the place that you really want to live. What this text says is there's something sacred and providential going on right outside your front door. And God has placed you there, and he's placed those people around you there for a reason. And the second half of this verse says, so that when those people reach out for God, that they have handles to grab onto. And I love the posture that's implied there. If you believe this text, it'll mess your life up. It'll change the way you drive into and out of your neighborhood. It'll start giving you eyes to see that like what you do in your front yard, what you do in your neighborhood counts. It's real ministry. It's just like serving on as a small group leader here, or as an elder, or being a greeter, or working with the kids ministry, which are all great things. They're all really great kingdom things. And guess what? So is taking the next step with the people who live right outside your front door. And I'm telling you, like, when you start building relationships on proximity, it is challenging. Like, I drift into relationships with people that I have a lot in common with. When you just start basing relationships on proximity, all of a sudden, you're hanging out with people that you would never choose to hang out with. Some of my friends are like, my new friends, they're like socially awkward people. It's hard for me to have I have to like work at having a conversation. Some of them aren't very funny. Some of them don't like sports. And some of them, a lot of them, they have gifts and interests and passions and things that I don't have any interest in. And as we've pushed through to the other side, I've started to believe that there's a discipline in being in relationships with some of these people. We started to like fill in voids in gifts and assets that the others don't have, and vice versa. It's been this incredible picture of what I really think the kingdom is supposed to be. And the willingness to just talk about life and to talk about things that we're struggling with and trying to process. The openness to do that has been shocking to me. And it didn't happen overnight. This is the long game. Okay? I'm just going to tell you right now, this is not like let's just go do this. This is the long game. Because real relationships take time. They really take time. And they take somebody actually making the first step. They take somebody leaning in and saying, like, I believe this is the best way to live. I really believe this is the best way to live. And the great news is this, that when you start to scale this thing out, it gets real exciting. You start to think about, like, this is the fourth service of the weekend here at Plum Creek. I was told between services there's about 1,000 households that call this place home. Now I just want you to imagine what happens when one church like this, when every single household says, you know what, we're going to take the next small step. We're going to at least be willing to do this. We'll take the little magnet thing, and we'll at least be willing to learn and retain and use people's names. Every single household does that here at this church. That means that there's 6,000 households that are touched by this one place. And if you, let's say, go low and say that there's 3 people in each of those households. It's 3 people in each of those. That's 18,000 people that get touched by one single church saying, I'm going to go back to kindergarten when it comes to the Great Commandment. It's pretty staggering. And I don't know where it goes from there. Now, by the way, if you were here 2 weeks ago, we passed out some of these, so if you got one, great. But they ran out. So this is the Plum Creek deal. I don't know why Doug wanted to let you guys off the hook. There's only 6 there. Here's my magnet. There's 8. Okay, so if you weren't here 2 weeks ago, now you got to learn 8 people's names, and you'll be better at neighboring than all the other people that were here. So as you leave here today, we're going to hand every single one of you, if you don't have one of these, we're going to hand every single household like this little magnet. And what I want to ask you to do is to put this on your fridge and to let it haunt you a little bit. Or just be, convicting. This, in my city, people started joking around calling this the chart of shame. There's a big difference between shame and conviction, okay? Let's have this be the chart of conviction. But just put this up on your fridge. And then write in the neighbors' names that you already know. And then would you just start looking for a way to have an interaction with the people that you don't? Maybe you're the type of person, maybe you're an extrovert and you're just like, yeah, I'll just walk right over there and knock on their door and tell them I'm an idiot, I don't know their name. Great, go do that, okay? Don't go over there with a sheet of brownies and ask for their name and then write it down in front of them and then ask them if they know where they're going when they die, okay? That's like super weird, okay? Like, hey, here's the thought too, okay? Which, by the way, I'm like a raging evangelist. Like when people come to know God, I can't even, it does something inside of me that I can't even describe. But I want to tell you something, okay? So I'm not saying that there's not a time and a place to do that, okay? But what I am saying is this. If your neighbor never takes a step closer to God, ever, the command to still be and to love your neighbors still stands. And when we approach people and when we interact with people with that posture, the best things happen. It's like this weird inverse relationship. If you go into this thing, this is like going to be some evangelism strategy, people sniff that out and it's weird and they actually won't want to be around you. If you go into this thinking like, I think there's a discipline in getting to know the people that live around me and then I'm going to learn about this person and share my life with them and share the things that I love with them, like golf or cars or baking or Jesus, that's normal. That's like a helpful thought as you're like out there beginning to lean into this. And I'm really excited because I know the leadership here at this church bleeds this. They bleed this. This isn't like some sermon series. This is something they're praying and strategizing about. How is this going to be part of the DNA of this church for the long haul? And I want to encourage you. I want to encourage you to think about just taking the next small step. I've been doing this dangerous prayer for a long time now, and it's had huge fruit in my own life. And all I pray is this. I say, God, what's the next small step you want me to take with one of my neighbors? And then I tell somebody what it is. My wife, usually. And then I hopefully act on that in a reasonable amount of time, and then I pray that prayer again. And so I'd like to do that here with you guys today. I'd like to just pray this prayer with you. And, we'll we're all busy, we're all running around, and this oftentimes is one of those moments where this hour in this room every week is hopefully a time where you get to slow down and get outside your normal rhythms and just connect with God in a really deep way. And so I just want to ask him to give us a thought, a nudge, to just speak to us and just help us understand and get a clear picture of what that next small step is that he might be wanting us to take. So if you would, just bow your heads with me. Father, would you speak to each one of us? Lord, would you just give us a thought, a nudge of like, what's the next small step that you want me to take with one of my neighbors? God, will you give us the courage to keep that very practical next step in front of us and to not let it get lost in the busyness of all the other stuff we're up to. God, give us the courage to be the kind of people that have mildly awkward conversations because we have faith that they're going to lead sometimes to something that's really, really significant. God, will you help us to be the kind of people that our neighbors experience as people that are living at a healthy pace, that are actually interruptible. Help us to be the kind of people that we're living in a way when we're actually around and we're actually present in our neighborhoods. God, thanks for your word, for the way that we can read through texts that we've read through or that we've heard numerous times, but then you still use them to just pierce right into our lives. So God, you treat us so much better than we deserve. And we just thank you for that. In your name, amen.